Thank you very much for joining us on this lovely afternoon. Welcome to this special presentation by Dr. Kirsten Pai Buick titled The Hands of Our Ancestors at Our Backs, the Conceptual Practice of Francisco Guevara, presented by Arquetopia in celebration of Francisco Guevara's exhibition at Puebla's Garco Galeria titled Presagios de Imperio, on view until September 7. First, Arquetopia would like to acknowledge that all our artists' residencies are located on historical lands that over the centuries have been continuously defended from the invasion of multiple empires, including Hispanic monarchy, the First French Empire, the British Empire, and the United States, beginning with the Mexican-American War. We recognize that our work is only possible because of the multiple histories of resistance and contestation that intersect in Mexico and Peru. Through our mission, we continuously acknowledge the voices of those who have been historically unheard, seeking to address the violence and injustices of settler colonialism and imperialism, knowing that envisioning justice is only possible in the anti-colonial way. This acknowledgement is not metaphorical, but rather an active engagement in which all of our artists' residencies and programs are included. It is the first step to honor the land, the wisdom, to love and respect the people that inhabit Mexico. And now to our esteemed guest. Dr. Kirsten Pai Buick is a tenured associate professor at the University of New Mexico, where she has taught for more than 23 years. She identifies as a scholar of the visual and material culture of the British Empire and the British diaspora, and in the U.S. Caribbean and India. Her teaching encompasses topics such as the surveys of British colonial and U.S. art, American landscape representation, African American art, pro and anti-abolitionist images in the Atlantic world, and seminars such as Photographing Jim Crow, 1890 to 1965, Patronizing Women, Taste and Collecting in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the Victorian Nude, representing women, men, intersex, and children. Buick has extensively published on African American art, including her book, who has been published twice by Duke University Press, titled Child of the Fire, Mary Edmonia Lewis and the Problems of Art History's Black and Indian Subject. Also, her second book, In Authenticity, Carol Walker and the Edicts of Racism, is currently on progress. And I would like to highlight three of her most recent essays. Race as Object Lesson, Objects of Rebellion, was published by Princeton University Art Museum in 2023. Emancipation, The Unfinished Project of Liberation, was published this year for the Eamon Carter exhibition titled A Controlled Burn, Discursive Emancipation, Abolitionism, and the Consolidation of Race in Visual Culture. And forthcoming is Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? The Aesthetics and Curatorial Politics of Invitation and Interruption in Imperial Museums. This will be published for the upcoming exhibition catalog for the Dartmouth College Hood Museum's exhibition titled Re-envisioning American Art. Dr. Buick's practice and counsel represents one of the fundamental cornerstones of Arquetopia, and she has been on its board of directors since its inception. She also serves on the editorial board of American Journal since 2017, and she is going on her third term. Buick is a recipient of the David C. Driscoll Prize for African American Art and was named Scholar of the Year by the College of Art Association in 2022. Dr. Buick.
Good afternoon, everyone. It really is an honor to be here, and I'm so happy to see some of my former students in the room in attendance. I was very honored when Paco asked me to speak at his opening at Garco Gallery. The event took place a couple of evenings ago, and in putting together this PowerPoint, I got to go back through my old photographs and exchanges with Paco over the years. And so some of you will see yourselves represented in the presentation because you have all contributed in some way to my growth as a scholar. Everything that I do is for my students. And so I really haven't updated my website. I'm actually a full professor. But and I'm headed towards retirement. I'm so excited. In 6 years, I retire and I go to play computer games. With that said, let's start the presentation, and you'll understand the title as we move towards the end of my talk. And it's an informal talk in that it's nothing I can read to you as a formal paper, but we take this trip together through the slides. So the hands of our ancestors at our backs, the conceptual practice of Francisco Guevara. And as you see, I'm professor of art history and chair of Africana studies at the University of New Mexico. My email is included in case any of you would like to correspond with me. If you need anything, just let me know. I'm always here for Arquetopia. And so I asked Paco if Arquetopia had a land acknowledgement, how would it read? What would it say? Because we are so used to, in the United States, these relatively empty land and labor acknowledgements that universities give as an absolving balm to their localized injustices. So take, for example, the University of New Mexico, that is in a majority brown state, but that refuses to hire Native American scholars, that refuses to hire Hispanic and Latino scholars. There's a reason why the majority of the faculty in a brown state and in a land grant institution would keep out brown and Black people. And so these land and labor acknowledgements become part of the problem. They become part of the justification for what are gatekeeper institutions. And I was very happy with Paco's land acknowledgement. I think it is beautiful. I think it is real. And those of you who come to Arquetopia, those of you who are valued alumni of Arquetopia, help Paco to live this truth, to make the land acknowledgement real. And so the family here at Arquetopia we thank all of you. And in terms of those who made the exhibition possible at Garco Gallery, we would like to thank Mariana Romano, director of Garco Gallery, Quetzalina Sanchez, president of the board of Arquetopia, and Patricio Riverol, executive director of cultural diplomacy, minister of foreign affairs. So I first met Paco in 2009. He was employed at that time in a nonprofit organization in Albuquerque called Open Classroom. And Open Classroom allowed their employees to take one class at the University of New Mexico. And who showed up that day in my seminar titled Race, Gender, and the Historiographies of Art? Paco and Emmanuel Ortega. They were both in that class together. But Paco would come to my office and we would have very long conversations about art and activism. And one day he asked, what should he focus on? He said, I'm a great organizer and I think I'm an okay artist. What should I do? What should I be? And I told him that you should honor all of your gifts, that the greatest betrayal of oneself is to dishonor a gift. And so when he left New Mexico, he honored those gifts and became both an artist and an activist. And you can encapsulate his practice as a conceptual practice. But let me tell you this, one of my frustrations at the University of New Mexico was that I couldn't find anyone who would help Paco. Our professor of Spanish colonial art refused to talk to Paco. because he assumed, based on Paco's complexion and his class, that Paco was part of the problems he experienced in a classist and racist Mexico. And I argued with this professor. I said, he's a student. You don't dismiss students. And it's funny because when Arquetopia started to expand, when it became internationally known, the same professor wanted to come back and lecture here. And I said, he has lost his place here. He does not deserve Arquetopia. He does not deserve a fraction of it in the way that you all do, having contributed to make Arquetopia what it is today. I was also shocked by the reluctance of some of Paco's peers, his fellow students, to engage with him. Those who worked on Mexican art, they were intimidated by Paco's knowledge of Mexico. And so he was dismissed. It was painful for me and shocking. I'm used to the kind of black-white Native American racism of the United States. I had never experienced that. For a student, I found very earnest and very deserving. So I'll just stop there and we'll go to the next slide. I could go on, but it was a great experience for me to meet Francisco and an honor to become his mentor. And this was his first assignment for me in my race, gender, and historiographies of art class. Do you remember this, Paco? It is Garfield Cemetery, Memory of Corn and Red Chili. And this was his explanation. I had each student provide an image and a paragraph explaining the object. And as a class, we workshopped the objects. And as he wrote, Garfield is a small town located in southern New Mexico. So here he is engaging with the place where he was at, very contextual in all of his approaches. It's a quiet community where everyone knows each other and it's famous for growing and harvesting red chili. Historically, red chili has been important to the region, including the southwest of the US and part of Mexico. Not only economically, but it has an important connection to the identity of the communities. Being so close to the US-Mexico border, many illegal immigrants pass through the town every day. Some of them will stay for the different seasons of chili harvesting, and some will continue their journey to California, Arizona, Texas, or to the north of the US. In addition, from the red chili, there's something else worth seeing in Garfield. It has two cemeteries, one with elaborated tombs for the people from the town, and one for the so-called unknowns, consisting of piles of rocks with no names, flowers, or elements to identify the deceased. And so this was Paco's memorial to those unnamed and unknown workers. And as you can see, it was food. And that's how I first encountered Paco as a food artist, very engaged with the things that are grown and combined to sustain us. But here, he honors a community that has been dismissed, erased, and who are unknown despite their labors on the land. And so I really do think of Paco as a conceptual artist. And conceptual artists use whichever materials and forms that are most appropriate to get their ideas across. This results in vastly different types of artworks that could look like almost anything, from performance to writing to everyday objects. The artists explore the possibilities of art as idea and art as knowledge, using linguistic, mathematical, and process-oriented dimensions of thought as well as invisible systems, structures, and processes for their art. Francisco's object is empire and the various acts and oppressions that are deployed as tools to shape our realities according to class, ability, nation, gender, and race or ethnicity. And I asked Paco to kind of give me a short and dirty CV, which I retitled A Record of Bravery. And in the year 2000, he decided to quit law school to fully commit to art. And that's when he met Dolores Olmedo Patiño and became her friend and protege. He also included the year that he met me. I took my seminar, became my student beyond borders, and learned to relish the fight, which I had learned from my own mother, and which led to Arquetopia. In 2009, he returned to Mexico and founded Arquetopia with Christopher Davis and his parents. In 2012, he followed Quetzalina's initiative to open Arquetopia, Oaxaca, focusing on textiles as a form of knowledge in order to challenge authenticity and indigeneity. In 2013, he established Arquetopia's critical methodology with the help of his international advisory board, becoming a unique artist residency program recentering ethics in art, following the teachings of Emmanuel Levinas and Audre Lorde. In 2015, he established Arquetopia's music programs and the Clarinet Camerata of Mexico, offering scholarships for young musicians under the guidance of Christopher Davis. And so Chris and Paco continue to give back to Mexico. They continue to honor context and place. In 2016, they opened Arquetopia in Peru, consolidating Arquetopia's global presence. In 2020, they produced The End of the Grand Tour, the first symposium of artist residencies of the Global South, focusing on the legacy of the Grand Tour and the dark implications of art in the invention of place. In 2019, he reestablished his art practice to honor his gifts and to honor all that his mother, Guadalupe Robles, taught him. In 2024, Arquetopia celebrates its 15th anniversary and has redefined itself as the anti-residency. So the themes of my talk this afternoon are Guevara's practice as a conceptual artist, Arquetopia as an extension of his conceptual practice, and the entanglements of art and empire in his art. And so really he deploys history as conceptual practice. And you find it not only in the materials that he uses, but also in the concepts around encounter. And so whenever you see in my PowerPoint a word in quotations, it is an extension of Paco's conceptual practice. And those conceptual practices are mirrors, encounter, etui, empire, featherwork, and indigo. And this is a work based on, that's part of his series of mirrors, and titled The Preservation of Property. And he writes, the links between the reigns of Montezuma II and Elizabeth I, Queen of England, converge in an obscure mirror reflection. Between 1548 and 1550, John Dee, advisor and astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, acquired an obsidian mirror stolen and smuggled from an early shipment from the Americas to the Habsburg Empire. Dee, who according to scholars straddled a fine line between natural and demonic magic, is also credited with the imperial vision of England, spurring the rise of the British Empire in the subsequent centuries. This mirror, now on permanent display at the British Museum's Enlightenment Gallery, was frequently used as a scrying device for divination to communicate with spirits and provide supernatural advice. Looking in the mirror is a series of obsidian and silver mirrors encrusted with precious gemstones exploring different manifestations of empire. And the thing about empire is that it requires both property and positive self-reflections. And so everything becomes empire's mirror. It's in fact how I describe imperial museums, like the British Museum or even the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They are monuments to the vanity of museums, of empires, monuments to the vanity of empires, monuments to the dangers of empire, containing so much stolen objects and ritual objects sacred to different groups of people, but here harvested and contained and preserved as property, as a kind of movable property. But property is also one of Paco's conceptual practices, the challenge to property and the ways in which the West envisions property as a way to distinguish between those who belong and those who must be exterminated. And in my class on landscape representation, I actually talk about property as a manifestation of the aestheticization of land. But that's something for later. And so I'll read the English and you can follow along with the Spanish, because the other thing I asked of Paco is that he write a statement about who he is. And he wrote artist and curator, but I added activist. Francisco Guevara is a visual artist, independent scholar, and curator based in Mexico and Peru. He specializes in Levinasian ethics applied to the design of cross-cultural artistic projects and the analysis of performativity in contemporary art practices. His experience spans more than 20 years of designing, curating, and managing art projects through visual arts education and international cooperation to promote social change. His essays and critical texts focus on place and history as ideological distortions. Property is also another ideological distortion. And he addresses subjects such as contemporary art practices, historiography of art, and the artist residency field that have been featured in numerous international publications. As a visual artist, Guevara investigates the historical construction of the differentiation processes, embodiment, and the concept of distortion through a wide range of artistic, historical mediums, including painting, installation, and metalsmithing. And I always love Timothy Mitchell's Colonizing Egypt. He's British, so that's why he spells colonizing with an S. But I often think of this quotation in relationship to not just Paco, but all colonial subjects who must survive somehow within imperial logics. And Mitchell says, in abandoning the image of colonial power as simply a coercive central authority, one should also question the traditional figure of resistance as a subject who stands outside this power and refuses its demands. And so here Mitchell is challenging the ways in which we romanticize the margins. And he says margins don't exist, that they cannot exist within empire. Empire will not allow margins to exist. And so colonial subjects and their modes of resistance are formed within the organizational terrain of the colonial state, rather than some wholly exterior social space. We are implicated by empire. We all must participate. How we choose to participate is up to us. I took this photograph after Chris and Paco bought the castle near downtown Puebla and painted it red. It was this rather benign light blue color that they painted a bold, bright red. And there's Paco reigning over his soon-to-be empire. It's my favorite photograph. And here he's talking with one of the workers. And he says that I begin every residency, and this is one of our conversations that we have constantly back and forth. And he says, I begin every residency by acknowledging that artist residencies are at the core of colonialism. We are the problem. That's why we need their help to disrupt this world, to interrupt the rationale of property that drives this greedy, horrible place that we call world. And in this way, Arquetopia becomes part of Francisco's conceptual practice. And there it is, the artist spaces that are pictured on the website. And on the window of one of the studios, reproduced with permission of the artist, are Deborah Roberts' studio rules. And she says, and those of you who have been here, you know that, you know this, you've seen it. But she asks herself to follow her own ideas, to ask new questions, to work without fear. If you work on the subject of women, change their status. Send a message, even if only certain people get it. New ideas while talking about the familiar, like hair, identity, the body, the gaze, colorism, sexism. Transform and be transformative. Think, 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 then write. Take a break, start again. And so the first concept is that of encounter. And I subtitled it When Global Capitalist Feminism Goes Very Wrong. One day Paco contacted me and asked me what gaslighting was. And I said, where'd you hear that term? Why would you hear that term? And one of the residents who's not on this call today, I had accused Paco of gaslighting. And I was like, what the fuck? But for me, it centered something very crucial about how global capitalist feminism works. And so last year, Paco allowed me to give a training to Arquetopia's international staff. And this was part of that conversation. But before I show you kind of the summation of that training, I want to show you something else. And it has to do with my students, how important you are to me, how seriously I take your questions, how seriously I take you. Before January 6th, when Trump allowed the US Capitol to be invaded, I was all over social media. And I use social media to talk to you, to extend my classroom beyond the time that you may have physically spent with me, to continue to engage you and to post things that I thought would be important to you. And so here's an exchange that Jocelyn began on Facebook, just responding to something I'd said. And she said, I meant to ask you about this a while back because it interested me when you said you don't fuck with the concept of the encounter anymore. And the F word is my favorite. I'd also like to hear from Francisco Guevara for clarification. We've talked about the face-to-face encounter being the only space that has not been colonized. Kirsten, when you refer to encounter here, what are you speaking of? And I wrote back, hey, Jay, I mean the benign whitewash concept fostered in some American studies scholarship and in the most recent textbook for US art. Ostensibly, the encounter acknowledges that influence is multidirectional, but when the concept is used to soften the violence of imperialism, then there is a problem. This is different from Levinas facing the other, which is how Paco uses it. And she responded, thank you for clarifying. I'm getting back into a lot of material for this past summer right now, or from this past summer right now, making use of this time at home. And then Francisco replied, he said, since its beginning, Arquetopia's residency programs have had to deal with the reality of the legacy of such so-called benign encounters. Mexico, as with many other places, has been continuously reinvented, much like the Orient, as a dangerous yet colorful and sexy fantasy world. Kirsten helped us understand that quite often cultural exchanges become a fantasy performance of mutual exchange and reciprocity, when in fact, their function is co-optation and appropriation. I absolutely agree that fuck is the right terminology to understand the concept of encounter at large, as desire is always intertwined. Levinas's theory radically challenged that tradition of encounter to understand it as the discovery of a basic obligation with one another. And he asks, is the desire for the other actual, or is the desire for the other an appetite or a generosity? Thus, we use the concept of encounter via Audre Lorde's notion on non-dominant differences, and Linda Bolton's and Sharon P. Holland's use of Levinas's theory. Do you remember that exchange, Paco? See, I keep everything. And it's thanks to you guys, really. And thank you to Jocelyn for initiating this conversation, because it allowed me to clarify and it allowed Paco to extend and expand the discussion. And so this is what happens at Arquetopia when less than 20% of the residents identify as men. So the majority of people who come to the residency are women. And during the training for the staff at Arquetopia, I wanted to kind of tease out the complexity of feminism and the fact that feminism can often work on behalf of both racism and sexism. For those who benefit globally from imperial systems, feminism is the screen behind which they hide their active participation and furtherance of such systems. When challenged, they immediately transform the relation from business and professional to intimate and domestic. There are some white feminists who have learned over centuries that the domestic space is the most successful from which they have been allowed by patriarchy to attack. White feminism is patriarchy's other face. And before we advance the slides, I want to give you some examples. So what do I mean when I say feminism benefits globally from imperial systems? And here's a rather mundane anecdote. I had a friend who works in my local plant store. I've known her, for about 8 years. And it was in the wake of the war between Hamas and Israel. And my students at the University of New Mexico were planning to walk out. At that point in the war, faculty at universities were being forced to be silent. And so the students told me the week before, we're going to walk out at 11:30. We are going to protest the brutality of Israel's war against innocent Palestinians. And I decided to go to class that day, if only to teach for half an hour, to give them a place to walk out from, to give them a place from which to leave and stage their protests. I didn't have to go in that day and teach for only half an hour. And so when they walked out, I went to the plant store because I needed to buy something alive, something living. And I, I saw my former friend. She was checking me out, and I said, "My students walked out today because of this war." And she said, "Oh, what is wrong with those students?" And I said, "What is wrong with the Israelis? I have been wearing kufiyas, armbands since 1985, protesting the oppression of Palestinian people and apartheid." At my graduation from the University of Chicago, I had an armband protesting apartheid and protesting the oppression of Palestinian people and the extermination of Palestinian people. And this is what she says. She says, "Well, my husband listens to Fox all day. It's always on in the background. And I have no choice but to hear this." But this is how she did it, right? This is how she played her feminism on behalf of racism and sexism, as if she was the victim of her husband's viewing choices. And she turned this disgusting global war into one of intimacy and domesticity, in which she gets to sacrifice her husband and portray the innocent within this. Okay. And this is how global capitalist feminists operate in Mexico, Peru, and Italy. Italy being a former space for Arquetopia's anti-residency. They love the culture while having contempt for the people. Amar la cultura mientras sentir desprecio por la gente. They have money and leisure, and money and leisure together equal commodified time. They have the commodified time to travel as tourists. In exchange for their money, you are to offer only comfort and as much safety as they will allow. In exchange for their money, you are to extend emotional comfort upon demand. Thus the charge against Paco of gaslighting, because he does not make you comfortable here. You're not supposed to be emotionally comforted when you travel to a space that is not yours. In exchange for their money, you are to treat them as perpetually innocent, but to endanger that innocent obliviousness causes anger and retaliation, resulting in horrible reviews online, attempts to close the space. And their innocence is intentional and therefore malignant. Specifically at Arquetopia, global capitalist feminists operate this way. They arrive to find that they must shed their malignant innocence. They arrive to find that their money has not secured a safe space for their racism, sexism, disregard, and desprecio. They arrive to find that the mission of Arquetopia is to interrupt and disrupt their fantasies of empire and contact with the natives. Notice how upset they become when Paco names individual staff who have been harmed, staff who had no function for them prior to the naming, except serving them and remaining invisible. Then they accused Paco and Arquetopia of gaslighting, a term that transforms Arquetopia into an intimate and domestic space in which they can in turn register their hurt feelings and hurt innocence. When I told Paco that he was operating as their fathers, husbands, lovers, uncles, he was disgusted. And so, but this is what Arquetopia actually is. It is a business that is concerned first and foremost with respecting the spaces in which it resides. And that means respecting staff, local artists, and the complexities of those communities, regions, languages, and countries. Like all good businesses, staff must be privileged and come first. My mother, speaking personally, was a secretary. And so I understood this on a fundamental level. And this is why I was so happy when Paco offered me this opportunity to talk to staff. As a business that has an ethical point from which it operates, profit is rendered secondary. Paco and Nayeli know. They know what to do to privilege profit, but they consciously choose ethics over profit. As a result, Arquetopia becomes a battleground to combat global capitalist feminism. Ironically, it is a battleground funded by the delusions of global capitalist feminism. And I love this statement that I asked Paco to write, in which he states clearly, Arquetopia is not a museum, nor is it a cultural center, nor is it a house for art. It is an unconventional space of disruption that centers mobility as the origin of the ethical problem and violence in the processes of artistic production, especially in Mexico and Peru. Its programs draw from diverse global knowledge and experiences, creating intersections to challenge perspectives and ways of seeing, particularly those that prioritize beauty over thought, aesthetic over responsibility, or irony over awareness. And in this way, Paco acknowledges the violence of aesthetics. It has become an anti-residency, distancing itself from the exploitation that art often promotes and reimagining the artist as an agent of change. However, an agent of change is not the creative genius inspired by nature, nor the one who views social changes with suspicion only to benefit from its abstraction and representation. Rather, they are the persons who daily seek new forms of coexistence without losing sight of the injustices occurring around them. And you can find this all on Paco's new website for Omens of Empire. And there's a beautiful invitation with the QR code that links to all of these things I asked Paco to write and that he expressed so beautifully. Presagios de Imperio. And he writes, the origins of injustice are often concealed in history, and understanding today's violence requires us to revisit the memory of the past. Omens of Empire warn or signal the potential for violence. However, violence is not limited to physical brutality or the annihilation of someone. True violence consists in betraying our substance and disrupting our continuity, perpetuating actions that will prevent us from recognizing ourselves in the future, destroying any possibility of action. Violence is accepting that abuse as natural and part of our DNA. That somehow art is exempt from responsibility, that aesthetics can substitute ethics, and that we can pursue individual paths instead of collective ones. And so etui is, I think, for me, one of Paco's most evocative concepts in his conceptual art practice. And I'd like to foreground James Baldwin's quote when I think about etui, or when Baldwin says, "History is not the past, history is the present. We carry our history with us. To think otherwise is criminal." And so the jewelry becomes a vehicle and a metaphor for how we burden ourselves with the past. And I asked Paco specifically about these earrings, and this is what he said to me about acts of translation and how these works are acts of translation. These specific earrings are based on this portrait. He says, "I look into 18th century paintings to find things that have been translated into images, but that are not easily understandable by us anymore. Then I show them to the silversmiths who recognize them in terms of knowledge of the materials and knowledge of how to work with metal and stones." And so he is collecting knowledge within these objects, not just looking at a painting and copying, but involving the silversmiths, involving their knowledge of the materials and how to work with them. And then he says, "And then I redesign them by translating them again into the historically loaded materials." And there's my sister wearing a pair of these conceptual pieces. Etui is the history that we carry with us. But practically, historically, traditionally, an etui is also a small ornamented case fitted with miniature implements for a woman's daily use. They might include such items as scissors, bodkins, needles, a thimble, a tiny knife, a pencil, or an ivory writing tablet. Etuis were worn in Europe from the 17th to the 19th centuries. And this is my sister in Detroit, Michigan, wearing this legacy, wearing this history. And then there is perhaps one of my favorite series, his Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And he names those who betrayed humanity by romanticizing the margins: Michel Foucault, Antonio Gramsci, Gayatri Spivak, and Ranjit Guha. And I just want to show you the first two pieces that are also etui, I think, can be accommodated under that. And this is Michel Foucault. The jewels spell out the word subaltern. Subaltern. And here you see the front and then the back. And then Michel Foucault. This one is Guha. Okay. Yes. And they can be worn around your neck or displayed. Indigo is extremely important to Francisco's practice. It's associated with profound thought, devotion, wisdom, and justice. The color is particularly dark as well, symbolizing that only intuition will allow you to see past the rich shroud. The production of indigo was important to the economy of 18th century Spanish America. The indigo plant was grown and processed principally in Guatemala, Venezuela, and Mexico, while the largest area of production was Guatemala and Venezuela. Venezuela followed closely in production figures. And then there's some numbers I don't care about. But I want to read you the quote by Michael Tosick that I think inspires Paco. He says, redemption, and Tosick is a cultural anthropologist who wrote, redemption can never be final because the gap between the old and the new can never be closed. Writing worth reading is built this way, writing being a continuous confrontation with the past that evoked it. Writing becomes an attempt to bridge, an unsuccessful attempt to bridge the old and the new. Such is the reflection of the sky in the sea. Such is indigo. And here is a painting by Paco titled Uranometria, and it's from the solar maps of an Englishman named John Bayer. And you see the constellation, but you also see embedded in the monstrous figure of the Dutch Empire / East India Corporation, the emblem of the East India Corporation, the VOC. Feather work is also extremely important to Paco's process. And here you see on the right the first omen, which is hand-woven wool dyed with indigo, feathers, and turquoise. And there's no picture, despite Roberto Camargo's brilliant photography, that can do these works justice. Feather work is the working of feathers into a cultural artifact. And so you see how the conceptual practice of Paco extends through materials. Every material is significant. Each material is weighted with that history that Baldwin says that we carry with us. And it was an especially elaborate art form among the Aztecs. Endowed with sacred meaning, feathers were associated with the Aztec patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, and the mythical god of feather workers, Coyolin Nahuatl. It is a symbol of status. Perhaps the most well-known example of Aztec feather work is a feather headdress such as the one thought to be worn by Montezuma II. As the Aztec emperor at the time of the Spanish conquest, his headdress was made of quetzal and other feathers and mounted in a base of gold and precious stones. And then my favorite, Omen of Continental Violence, which is derived from a panel in the Bayeux Tapestry. Next slide. There it is. You can see it in the register right above the scene with the figures, the Halley's Comet. Again, Timothy Mitchell, he talks about how imperial logic works. And he says colonizing refers not simply to the establishing of a European presence, but also to the spread of a political order that inscribes in the social world a new conception of space, new forms of personhood, and a new means of manufacturing the experience of the real. And let me give you an example how new forms of personhood are introduced. In the 19th century, men began to take over medicine. They expel midwives from the birthing room. They take over the care of women's bodies. They elevate gynecology to a respectable branch of medicine. And they begin to interpret women's bodies and women's pain. And so this is when the practice of shaving women's pubic hair for birth began, because men thought it was unhygienic, when actually pubic hair stops the transmission of germs to the child. They also began to investigate and correct infants born intersex. And they begin to intervene on the bodies of these infants. And this is how they began to physically designate one gender, one sex per body. They would measure the genitalia and decide oh, this is a penis, or this is a vagina, and cut accordingly. And to this day, doctors continue to intervene in this way physically in order to invent the concept of gender. And this is something I run through with my students all the time. It is racism, it's the ideology that invents the identity. And so racism is what constructs and maintains race. Nationalism is what constructs and maintains nation. And it is sexism that constructs and maintains gender. And so we are new forms of personhood because of empire, the globalization of medicine, and the refusal to allow people to exist within their own complexity. Empire seeks to simplify us, to define us, to delimit who we can be in this world. They manufacture new experiences of the real. And I'm proud to announce that Francisco Guevara is extending Arquetopia into embassies across the globe. Arquetopia's embassy program will travel between 2025 and 2027 within the United States, from places as far as San Francisco to New Brunswick. It will appear in Mexico, in Oaxaca, in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, and in Nigeria. And so I'm so happy that after 15 years, the state of Puebla has chosen to acknowledge, I think, one of their most valuable assets, and that he is now going to be recognized globally. And watch in the next 10 years the evolution of Arquetopia, because you all belong here. You are all part of this. You have all made this possible. Ah, I didn't mean to include this, but yes, happy birthday, Paco, when I was still on Facebook. And he said to me, "You are a beacon of light in this stupid, dumb world. Thank you for your great evil mind, your twisted sense of humor, and your immense heart." Okay. And finally, I would like to thank him. He started as my student. He quickly became my inspiration and my friend, and I consider him my brother. And thank you from the Arquetopia family, Chris Davis, Nayeli Hernandez, Emmanuel Ortega, Francisco Guevara, and me, Kirsten Pai Buick. I think there's one more. And so this talk from the other evening is actually dedicated to Paco's mother, who, when I would come to town, would always take me to lunch and ask me what I was working on. She was the most powerful and influential figure in Paco's life. Arquetopia would not exist had she not taught him how to perform his freedom. I love her, I miss her, and she is the ancestor who continues to push us forward into the future. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Buick. Thank you, Francisco. And just to remind everybody, Presagios de Imperio will be on view at Garco Galeria from, well, it started on Friday, but it will be on view all the way to September 7. And thank you, everybody, for joining us of this special program by Arquetopia, and have a wonderful day.